Thank you for joining us. We will begin shortly. Thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the event.
Hello, I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Sentry International. Welcome to today's launch event for a fantastic report about the Yemeni Houthis and their smuggling networks with our fellow Peter Salisbury. I'm going to just do a couple of quick housekeeping notes and then introduce the report, and then we're going to turn to Peter for the meat and potatoes of this event. So the event is being translated into ASL and CART for those with accessibility needs. And what was the other thing I'm supposed to share? Oh yes, you can turn on captions on your web browser at Stream Text. We are going to be taking questions. You don't have to wait till the end. You can submit your questions on YouTube, and then our and our staff will funnel them to me, and I'll be able to direct them to Peter. So without further ado, let's get into the substance here. The Century Foundation is a progressive independent think tank that conducts research, develops solutions, and drives policy change to make people's lives better. We've been doing this since 1919, and our international work, which dates back to the early days of the League of Nations, has been dedicated towards conflict resolution and really understanding the social drivers of conflict. I'm really proud to be working with Peter on his in-depth field research on Yemen's Houthis and the axis of resistance, which really draws on the most powerful articulation of this vision. Essentially, policymakers, especially in places like the United States, try to usually bomb their way through complex policy problems in places like the Red Sea and the Middle East, hoping that they can use force to get rid of intractable or difficult power players like the Axis of Resistance members allied with Iran, and especially groups like Yemen's Houthis, who have been chronically underestimated since they burst onto the scene decades ago. Peter's work uses an extensive network of on-the-ground researchers doing field research in the affected areas in Yemen and as you'll hear shortly, in ports and trade hubs as far afield as Rotterdam and China, to help us understand actually how Yemen's Houthis have become a formidable military power. And there's going to be a lot of very direct policy implications of this research, because once you understand how this actually works, one, it changes your understanding of the group and of regional dynamics, and two, it gives lie to the idea that there's some kind of simple military tool that can be used to resolve this as a policy problem. You can find the report on Century's website. The title is From Smugglers to Supply Chains, and it's a fantastic read. It's the result of more than a year of research and another year of analysis. I strongly encourage those of you who are interested to download it, read it, and share it. And without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to Peter to talk about the contents of the report and how they did the research and what they found. After he finishes, we're going to have some Q&A between the two of us and take audience questions. The more questions you all submit, the more time we'll spend on them. So as things come up and come to mind, just drop them into the chat, and we look forward to the conversation. Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Thanasi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to remove my face from the screen. I'm going to show you some slides. I'm just going to start by thanking Thanasi and Century International for their support in being the home for this project, and thanking Accept, the cross-border conflict evidence policy trends organization in the UK, for their support for this work. I would also be really remiss to not point you to the very end of the report online and in PDF, and ask you to have a look at the really incredible group of people who worked on this report. I'm going to be doing the talking. I'm going to present the findings, and my name is on the report, but this is the product of really incredible collaborative teamwork. And I'm really proud of what the team of Yemeni, American, British, international researchers put together, a really diverse team using a really interesting mix of methodologies. All right, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about the Houthis. I won't go into detail about the number of attacks that the Houthis have launched using long-range drones and missiles, first into Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea, the UAE, Israel, up to 2,600 kilometers from Yemen's borders. But I will say that when I was based in Sana'a in 2014 and the Houthis came in and took over the capital, they were what you would pretty much imagine from a non-state armed group, in terms of their technological sophistication. They had AK-47s, they had rocket launchers, they got armored vehicles, they got hold of some tanks, and they probably had some sort of low-level guided missiles. Fast forward about 12 years, and we see a group that last year, in between March and May of 2025, brought the US arguably to a standstill in the Red Sea, where the US had major military assets in the region, was bombing the Houthis, and the Houthis were fighting the US using anti-ship ballistic missiles and drones, and caused them enough trouble that the two agreed to a truce after about 2 months of this. So that's one part of the story. The question is, how did this happen? And when we started this project, what we were told was, oh, you're going to be interested in the dhows, these little sort of Red Sea traditional ocean-going vessels that go from Iran to Yemen. And the story was that the Houthis' capabilities came entirely from Iran transferring weapons via this route. Now, there's a lot of truth to that, but what we discovered was something really fascinating. We found that the Houthis have been transformed from passive recipients of smuggled arms, which is how I think we all conceive of a group like the Houthis, into active participants in a sophisticated global manufacturing supply chain. They increasingly assemble and manufacture their own arms. So that's one part of the story. And the question is, how did they get here? And of course, tutelage from Iran, tutelage from members of the Axis of Resistance, particularly Hezbollah, is essential to this. But where we end up today is that the Houthis are part of a kind of a knowledge ecosystem, a kind of Axis of Resistance internet of knowledge on how to procure, how to build, and how to deploy increasingly sophisticated weapons. And this is quietly but importantly precedent setting for state actors and non-state actors. If you go back those 12 years to 2014, and if you had told me, if you told an arms expert, that within a decade, a group like the Houthis would be able to launch drone strikes with precision 2,600 kilometers from Yemen's borders, they would have been really, really surprised. And if you are another group in the region, in Africa, anywhere in the world, and you're looking at the Houthis, it's really interesting to see that evolution, and you're going to want to get in on the act. But let's start at the start. I'm going to try and mix methodology in here with what I'm telling you as I go. But when we started this project, one of the first things we did was ask this question: what do the Houthis have? What was in Yemen at the start of the war, and what have they got hold of since it began? And the really simple answer is they possess a really large stockpile of weapons not present in Yemen before 2017. And where they came from, Iran is part of the answer. Almost all of, especially the sophisticated weapons the Houthis use Iranian designs, use Iranian technology. But the Houthis now operate multiple lines of assembly or manufacture. And in many cases, they've reached what we call a capability tipping point. That's the ability to go out into the world, to buy the stuff that goes into these weapons, get it into Yemen, build them, and stick them in the air, particularly with these long-range UAVs, which is the subject of the next part of this project. The other thing we did was build out a database based on public and private sources of interdictions. So what's being stopped on sea, what's being stopped on land in Yemen by local security forces, by the Yemeni Coast Guard, by international maritime forces in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa. And we put together this database. And what we saw was that it told us exactly this story of this transition from smugglers to manufacturers, from smugglers to supply chains using the data. And at the beginning of the war and through sort of the early 2020s, what we see is that the majority of what's being smuggled into Yemen is complete arms systems. So AK-47s, rockets, bullets, entire cruise missile systems or partially disassembled ones, entire drones. By the sort of 2018 to 2021 period, that starts evening out. And more of what's being stopped coming into Yemen is components. It's engines, it's little electronic things that go into drones or missiles to guide them. And by sort of the 2023 to 2026 period, so more or less directly coinciding with the beginning of the regional war that was precipitated by Hamas's assault on Israel and the Israeli counter-assault into Gaza around the 7th of October 2023, is the Houthis really transition to bringing in components, or at least visibly bringing in more and more components. Some of this stuff is coming from Iran. And in fact, the more sophisticated bits of kit, particularly related to missiles, still comes from Iran. Still an essential part of the supply chain, but more and more of it actually comes from China. So again, 2015 to 2017, pretty much complete systems. 2017 to 2021, a growing inflow of components and raw materials, chemicals for explosives. And from 2021 onwards, what we see in the interdiction data is just more and more components coming into the country. And what we then started doing was taking that interdiction data, working with really brilliant Yemeni researchers and others to map out the different routes by which these different things come into the country. And what we learned was, again, gas from Iran, big, important part of the story, but no longer the whole story. And we saw a proliferation, not just of arms, but of smuggling methods. And as we make this shift from smuggling complete systems to smuggling components that can come from anywhere, it opens up the number of routes that you can use to bring things in. So what we see is first, there's this channel from Iran where dhows come to the waters of the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. They stop off near Somalia, they stop off near Yemen, and they often transfer their contents to other small vessels that then go to Houthi-controlled areas, or they go into government-controlled areas in the east of Yemen, and they're trafficked overland into Houthi areas. What we also saw was that when the opportunity is there, Iran and the Houthis will bring large amounts of items into Yemen directly. So in 2023, just before and after October of 2023, what we saw was cargo ships departing Bandar Abbas and Rajai ports in Iran and going directly to Houthi-controlled ports And what regional, Western, and Yemeni officials believe is that these shipments weren't carrying humanitarian aid. They were carrying fairly important and large amounts of weapons components. So this is more or less what you'd expect for an Iran-aligned group. But what we also see is that the Horn of Africa has become a channel in and of itself, that things are being procured from all over the place, brought to Somalia, and brought increasingly to Djibouti before being transshipped both via small fishing skiffs, dhows, but all the way up to cargo ships intermingle with legitimate cargo. And that stuff is going into Yemeni ports controlled by the Houthis, and also Yemeni ports and landing sites controlled by ostensibly Yemen's internationally recognized government. So an additional supply chain being brought in there. Then you've got international commercial shipments to Yemen. And what we see here is that goods are being brought from India and being brought from China in increasingly large volumes, stuck in containers and brought to Yemeni ports. Until 2022, 2023, the only route in would really have been Aden, because that was the only container port receiving containers. But after 2023, Houthi-controlled ports were allowed to receive containers, and we saw probably a really big uptick in the volume of goods coming from China in particular into Yemen. And one of the really kind of revelatory pieces here is that last August, authorities in Aden inspected about 40 plus containers that had come off a ship that was meant to go to Houthi controlled areas. But because of the Houthis' FTO designation and damage to ports in Houthi areas due to Israeli airstrikes, what we saw was that it was redirected to Aden. People opened it up, and we've got equipment for making drones, for making missiles, for making weapons, so making guns, AK-47s. And really, what's fascinating in that shipment, but quite frightening, is the sophistication of the manufacturing equipment that's now being brought in. So the Houthis aren't just bringing in components, they're bringing in quite sophisticated kit to do machine tooling, to kind of do the more complicated bits of manufacturing, assembly, and drilling equipment, so that they can start digging deeper and deeper tunnels to make the effective airstrikes less effective. And finally, and brilliantly, the slide isn't here, but finally, what we also see is the goods are brought to the UAE and Oman, both via licit international shipment and via kind of illicit, kind of mainly some small boats from Iran to the Omani coast, stuck on trucks and brought to Yemen, brought over the Omani border and then shipped overland into Houthi-controlled areas. So what we see is that over the course of the conflict, the routes by which different goods can be brought to Yemen as the Houthis become manufacturers, the number of routes and methods of bringing things in multiplies. And what I'm showing you here is just a quick, simple slide showing some of the methods that we've seen being used. So on the top left, you've got what is probably specialized smugglers, people whose entire job is getting out there in really hard to cross areas of Yemen, sticking stuff on the back of trucks and moving it into Houthi areas. The next two show you shipping containers. And in the first image, what you see is fairly clearly some artillery. And then next, you've got someone kind of taking a video of himself and showing where he's hiding things in a shipping container in Aden, in a government-controlled port city, before it's stuck on a truck and moved up to Houthi-controlled areas, so that the people who are receiving it on the other end know where he's hidden the stuff. You've got things stuck in with fruit and vegetables, you've got things stuck in with conventional electronics, and then you've got chemicals used to make explosives being stuck in with what's meant to be conventional fertilizer shipments. So multiple methods coming in multiple ways, multiple routes, really hard to spot. And it, again, intermingled increasingly with legitimate international cargo. So that's a big challenge if you're trying to stop this stuff. The other challenge is that Yemen doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we had these really two great OSINT researchers, Roland and Amanda, working with us, who did a fantastically hard piece of work using AIS tracking software and satellite software to look for suspicious shipping patterns in around the coast of Yemen, and to see if they could detect ship-to-ship transfers, smuggling, so on and so forth. And they cast a really wide net. And what we found instantly is there was just a ton of this really suspicious, weird activity all over Yemen, all over the Horn of Africa, all over the Red Sea. And for example, we spent quite a lot of time trying to investigate what we thought was ship-to-ship transfers, potentially of goods, off the east coast of Yemen. And we thought, we've done it. We've busted these guys. We can tell you who the ships are. And we found out that something dodgy was happening. Oil, or more correctly, fuel, was being smuggled to Yemen, and ship-to-ship transfers, probably of Iranian fuel, were being conducted off the east coast of Yemen to be brought into Yemen and probably brought into the Horn of Africa as well. But they weren't part of the Houthi supply chain. And in fact, there was a growing body of evidence that a government of Yemen affiliated businessman was the guy behind that particular network. So looking for this stuff and trying to distill it is really about trying to find needles in haystacks. Now, the other thing that we saw was the level of sophistication of some of the bits of the smuggling supply chain that we couldn't quite put our finger on. So to take a step back here, there have been dozens of interdictions of smuggled arms from Iran and on other forms of shipment coming into Yemen since the beginning of the war. The Houthis have used hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles, but the number of ballistic missile motors, which are a relatively sophisticated bit of kit in which arms experts, at least at the beginning of the project, didn't think could be smuggled into, could be produced in Yemen, although their view may have changed on that. They said it would have to be smuggled in. And what we realized was there are bits of the supply chain that are simply still invisible to us. And as we kind of cast the net wider and wider, what we were told was you should look at this spy ship that the Iranians had posted in the Red Sea. And lo and behold, when we looked at this ship, the Beshad, what we found was that it sat there for about sort of 2.5, 3 years. And via various satellite ship tracking tools, other bits of kit, what we found was on a pretty regular basis, vessels, big cargo vessels, container ships associated with the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines would come and stop not too far, but not alongside the Beshad. And then what we also saw was that on a pretty regular basis historically, other large cargo vessels, so again, big container ships, not little dinky fishing ships, would appear in the same zone, often having come from the coalition holding area, this kind of holding pen for vessels that have been stuck next to Yemen to prevent smuggling. And we also found that on a pretty regular basis, other smaller ships were coming up to these various vessels, probably to conduct ship-to-ship transfer. Now, I'm not saying that we have definitive proof this was being used to smuggle the items that we're interested in, but it did give us an insight into potentially how some of the people who were moving in and out of Yemen might have got in and out of the country. Because the other thing to bear in mind here is that this transition from smugglers to supply chains really required a large number of people moving in and out of Yemen. And that still remains something of a mystery to folks looking at these various issues. The last piece I'll say here is that when we think about the known knowns and the unknown unknowns of smuggling of arms and building out the knowledge of the Houthis, their capabilities, new routes are probably coming into play as we speak right now. And the team, over the past 6 to 8 months, has been looking at Houthi networking in Africa. We have a forthcoming separate report on this, and it looks like transfers are now being made from the coast of Sudan and potentially from Eritrea. And what we had been told and what we had thought throughout the project was, yes, stuff like this is happening, but it's mainly small arms, conventional kind of ant trafficking of smaller pieces. But a growing body of evidence indicates that new supply chains are coming online even as we speak. We've only been able to present in the report what we feel that we have verified based on the empirical data that we have, but there's a lot out there still to be found out. Now, the final piece here to consider is what has happened since October 2023. After Hamas's attack on Israel and the Israeli offensive on Gaza, the Houthis started attacking Red Sea shipping and firing missiles and drones at Israel. Last March, the United States intervened, along with a variety of other actors. But the US intervened militarily between last March and May, attacking Houthi production sites and launch sites for various weapons used to attack the Red Sea. For the previous year, various maritime coalitions had been in the Red Sea to defend commercial vessels and other naval vessels against Houthi attacks. And yet, at the same time, as this was happening, we were using various remote sensing techniques to look at the volume of goods coming via what we were fairly confident were key smuggling interchange points. And what we saw was, rather than dipping over the course of the regional confrontation, was that the volume increased. So we ended up in this very paradoxical place where the amount of effort, the amount of resource being thrown at preventing Houthi attacks was increasing, but the effort going into stopping them get the stuff needed for the attacks really remained essentially, if not static, at a relatively low level. And the effort going into bringing stuff into Yemen for the Houthis increased, I would say, almost exponentially during that period. And that brings us to this question of policy. And what happened when we started digging into, well, what's happening on the other side of this? What's happening to efforts to stop these things being smuggled to the Houthis? What we found was just a real fragmentation within anti-Houthi forces in Yemen, within the regional players with an interest in Yemeni security, and within the international system. So for a period in 2025, you had probably the densest naval concentration outside of the South China Sea, but arms and material continuing to flow. And what we found was that interdiction efforts were still focused on vessels, international interdiction efforts, really focused on vessels from Iranian ports. But the supply chain was increasingly concentrated on components flowing through legitimate or semi-legitimate hybrid commercial channels. And at the same time, I would say over the last 2 years, we saw a significant increase in the level of effort anti-Houthi forces were putting into anti-smuggling efforts, partly to try and curry favor with outside powers, but also as part of a real concerted effort to stop this stuff from happening. But the thing that was getting in the way of that was competition between the anti-Houthi forces, non-payment salaries, and clashing regional agendas, which became so starkly clear last December and this January, when Saudi Arabia effectively intervened militarily against a UAE-backed group that took over the east of the country, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Emiratis were forced by the government and the Saudis to completely leave Yemen. New forces entered key areas across the country. Now, this could represent an opportunity. We now have more or less sort of unified oversight of the different military chains of command within Yemen, but an extremely fragile political context in government-controlled areas. And the question is there an opportunity here for a cohesive anti-smuggling agenda? And the one player that could be really consequential here is the United States. And the United States started last year, 2025, that should read, not 2026, I apologize, with an FTO designation and airstrikes against the Houthis. So they designated the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. And then they agreed to a truce with the Houthis, part of this new pattern of highly transactional US, very interest-based, short-term interest-based approach to mediation. And what we were told kind of consistently by former US officials and current US officials as well is that the Trump administration, and I don't mean the professional services, but the sort of political bit atop all of that, treats Yemen as a settled matter. What they say is, we did it. We restored deterrence. We stopped the Houthis attacking American ships in the Red Sea. We restored kind of our version of freedom of navigation. And that's it. That's all we need to do. And at one and the same time, we saw this surge in the amount of stuff that was going into Yemen, even after the airstrikes and the FTO. So what we see on the one side is this sense that, this problem has been dealt with, which has a chilling effect on other actors as well, and their willingness to engage because of the high political, military, material costs of really trying to sort of either take the Houthis on militarily or put in a concerted effort to stop smuggling, particularly via maritime interdiction. And there is this sense that the US is kind of interested, and I would say sort of US officials broadly working on Yemen really see the challenge here. But at the top political level, the sense is that sort of this is dealt with, and now we're going to move on. So I'll come back to where we are on Yemen. This is kind of the overall map of what I described. And what you can see basically is many, many channels for different things to come into Yemen and the ability very, very quickly for the system to adapt. So what we often see is that Yemeni forces, international forces work out a smuggling route, they tamp down on it, and within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the supplies are simply been rerouted via another route. And if the Red Sea does come into play and it does turn out that sort of the east coast of Africa is being used for transshipment and other forms of smuggling, that just opens up another chain. So policy is very, very far behind the challenge here, but there are some choke points that one can focus on and think about in trying to prevent all of this. But the point we came to, and this is sort of maybe sounds a little bit pie in the sky at this moment in the world's history, is this idea that the only way you can pull this off, the only way you can stem the flow of stuff going to the Houthis and raise the cost of what they're doing, let alone prevent them from procuring, manufacturing, and using these advanced weapons, is via really concerted, multinational, multilateral effort. So you need international coordination, international thinking, and resource to approach this problem. But our understanding is that some sort of Western states at this point in time would struggle to fund even a sort of a basic surveillance drone to fly over a particular area of Yemen. So a real mismatch between Houthi capabilities, Houthi intent, the direction of travel, and where international policy actually is on this issue. So to quickly recap, we've seen the Houthis transform from passive recipients into active of arms, into active participants of a sophisticated global manufacturing supply chain, the diffusion of knowledge via the movement of people and expertise within the Houthi movement. Much harder now that the Houthis know how to procure and build these things to stop them from doing it, as evidenced by the fact that key top Houthi missile and drone operatives were killed by the US and Israel last year, but that their attacks continued. So eliminating key leaders or temporarily severing individual supply lines is unlikely to degrade their capabilities. And again, returning to this point, the precedent the Houthis have set for other actors should not be underestimated. And I would argue, and future work will show, that it's really generating a lot of interest from other actors and surprising actors, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, for example, in having relationships with the Houthis. Okay, thank you so much for your time and attention. Apologies for any verbal stumbles. Thanasi, back to you.
Peter, thank you so much for that fantastic work and pithy overview of your findings. I've got a couple of questions for you before we turn to the audience questions. The first thing I want to ask you about is what did you find in terms of the geography of these supply chains? How do legal, licit, above board suppliers in China and shipping networks that are not known to be smuggling networks factor into this supply chain network that the Houthis have assembled?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating part of the story, and it's something that we continue to look at. And it kind of shows you how these supply chains can come almost out of nowhere. So Yemenis are actually probably the largest Arab community in China. And a lot of Yemeni businessmen from the north of the country, before the war had even started, had recognized the opportunity in sending their kids to study business and Chinese, to work in China and send kind of relatively low cost Chinese goods, not just to Yemen, but to the entire region. So when the war started, some of these folks, and I'm definitely not saying the entire community at all, a relatively limited number, some had ties to the Houthis and the various folks that were working with them in the north. They started sending relatively basic stuff, uniforms and bullet belts to Yemen. And as time passed and Houthi needs grew, what you saw was more than likely pretty deep collaboration between senior Houthis in Sana'a and IRGC officials, including sort of people who work on the R&D side in Iran, to work out what their needs were. But then the Houthis working through diaspora social networks to get people in China to procure and ship these things. And when you've got people who work on sort of import export, so buying stuff and sending it to the region, but also Yemeni run logistical networks. So folks in China, a couple of who have now been sanctioned, who are running legitimate commercial cargo, but are more than willing to stick a few naughty things into a shipping container from there. So it's one of those things that looks incredibly sophisticated, and certainly would have been 20 years ago, but with encrypted communications, with a diaspora in place, and with China as this sort of phenomenal builder of intermediate goods, much, much easier today than sort of when you and I both started out covering these kind of issues a little while ago.
And I mean, this framing, so there's two things from the title that I want you to unpack a little bit. So that I didn't say the full title of the report earlier, but it's, from smugglers to supply chains, how Yemen's Houthis have become a global threat. The first thing I want to ask you to unpack a little bit is what is being supplied? You alluded to this a little bit at the beginning when you said that the Houthis went from being passive recipients of smuggled arms to active creators of supply chains. But correct me if I'm wrong, they're not using the supply chains to buy finished weapons. They're using the supply chains to essentially engage in economic development. Like if this were pharmaceuticals, we'd be very happy to see this, right? Instead of importing drugs, they're learning how to make their own drugs. But this time it's drones and missiles and AK-47s. But what is it that they're supplying? Because I think that this is, not lost in this detail of how they got it, but I don't want to lose sight of what's being gotten, which is equally significant to how it's being gotten.
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. And I mean, the answer is everything in many ways, depending on the level of Houthi manufacturing sophistication. So the example that we're working on for forthcoming work is that we've broken down a Houthi drone, a Houthi UAV, one of the longer but not longest range ones they do, called a Qasif-2. And we've gone through our interdiction data and we've gone through trade data from Yemen. And what you see is they're importing engines from China and various other small components. They're importing Western-made components for guidance systems, which are shipped via Hong Kong. They are importing chemicals from China and India that they turn into homemade explosives in Yemen. And they're importing electronic detonator pins from India that go into the front of the drone to make it go bang. They're importing fiberglass from China primarily, and they have some kind of system inside Yemen now to mold that into the frame, the chassis for the UAV. So you've got basically almost all these components, and there are 2 or 3 items that they get from Iran, and they could, if they needed, procure internationally. So what you're seeing is they're gradually moving up the production chain. They still need for kind of the more sophisticated pieces on the drones. They definitely still need sort of relatively good intermediate items. They're not going to be able to build engines themselves at scale anytime, but nor do they need to, because you can get them from China. And when it comes to things like missiles, the missile motors, particularly sort of for these solid fuel missile motors that we've kind of looked at, and sort of some of the more complex pieces that can only really go into a missile. A lot of that stuff still appears to come from Iran. But again, from the more recent seizures, what we see is an effort to move towards building these things domestically in many cases. So again, a trajectory and a direction of travel towards bringing in kind of sophisticated manufacturing equipment and machine tools to be able to build more and more of this stuff themselves.
And the second question I wanted to ask you to unpack from the title is, to what extent have the Houthis become a global threat? I mean, we talk a lot about threat inflation and alarmism. On the other hand, their ability to shut down global shipping seems quite significant, as is their ability and willingness to use long-term drones, as they did in their attacks on targets in Israel. And I want to pair this with a question from a member of the audience who asks, to what extent has, according to your understanding, the military capacity of the Houthis evolved over the last 1 to 2 years? Has it been strengthened or weakened?
Yeah, so let me start with the Houthis' military capability, and then I'll come back to the threat piece. Um, I would say there's definitely been some damage done to the Houthis in terms of the loss of top leaders, in terms of the loss of expertise and the destruction of storage and production facilities. But again, you've got to think of the Houthis not as kind of isolated actors, but as people who are plugged into this bigger knowledge ecosystem. Hezbollah can do this stuff too, right? They can build drones and missiles. Some parts of the Hashid in Iraq can do some of this stuff. So when the Houthis lose a leader, what do? They adapt. They work out what that person knew. They work out where they can tap into that knowledge. They elevate someone else from within. When someone blows up an outside sort of manufacturing facility, they start drilling. They start bringing drilling equipment so they can go underground, as Hezbollah have done, as the Iranians have done, so that their manufacturing and storage facilities are immune to sort of all but the most the heaviest of airstrikes. So every time we see setbacks, because they're able to tap into this knowledge ecosystem, and because the effort continues, they become better adapted to what's going to happen next. And in terms of, I mean, military capability, practice is kind of helpful. And one of the things that the Houthis have done is they've both been able to kind of test these weapons live. They are the first state or non-state actor to use anti-ship ballistic missiles in anger in this, or I think any other century. They went toe to toe with the US Navy in the Red Sea. They're going to have learned a lot from that. These are learning exercises as well. So every time they do this stuff, it's one step back, sure, but it's 2 steps forward in terms of their adaptation and lessons learned. And that comes to your question about threat, Thanasi, which is one of the reasons we said that they're a global threat. Well, there are 2 reasons. First is the demonstrable impact they had on global trade. And second is their ability to inflict cross-border damage increasingly far from Yemen. And then the third piece, again, is this model for other groups, where, again, we live in an age where if my washing machine breaks, I can go on YouTube and I can work out how to do it. And what the Houthis have kind of done is shown that with the right combination of knowledge and access to international sort of social diaspora networks, one can get pretty far towards having capabilities that, even 10 years ago were the preserve of pretty wealthy and powerful states.
We've also got some, so I think you answered that audience question about how has their strength fared over the last 1 or 2 years. You can come back to that additionally if you want in further answers. We have a couple of specific questions from the audience, and I'll pair 2 of them because they're about the details of the supply chain. One question is, which components of the Houthi arsenal are produced domestically, with an emphasis on UAVs, missiles, drone boats, and underwater drones? And a second question was, what is the role of Oman in the Houthis' access to weapons or components.
Sure. So from the data that we've gathered on interdictions, on kind of recovered weapons, I'd say there's kind of this sliding scale. The Houthis can manufacture pretty sophisticated IEDs, improvised explosive devices, not quite from scratch. You know, they still need things like detonator pins. They still need to sort of get sort of various chemicals in. They're not able to kind of do a lot of the chemistry themselves at the start, but they can build the casing. They can put the piece together with UAVs, with drones. Again, they're not building the motors, but they can get the different bits themselves, put them together, and effectively sort of do the final stage of manufacturing. On missiles, I think it's more of a mixed bag. I think even with kind of the outer casing of the missiles, they can build them. And certainly sort of the folks we've worked with have seen slightly dodgy, knocked together, not very well welded missile casings. But at the same time, the Iranians have also continued to send even missile casings to them. So with the missiles and the really high end kit, definitely still more reliant on Iran for sort of dissembled pieces coming into Yemen. On the UAVs, they can essentially manufacture themselves from raw materials and component parts. On the role of Oman, look, I have not seen any evidence that the Omanis are playing a role in Houthi smuggling. I think the critique that we have heard from various Western officials is that Omani attention to the issue of things moving through Oman and into Yemen is quite variable. That it's brought to bear and smuggling is stopped, and then the sort of when attention disappears, then more stuff starts moving through. Different folks draw different conclusions from this, but we haven't seen sort of any evidence that that's kind of a sin of commission or omission.
How is pressure on Iran and the limitations being created for Iran by the Western campaign in turn affecting Yemen's ability to build or maintain these supply networks? This is an audience
Yeah,
question.
it's a good question. And we certainly sort of heard from people an expectation that kind of the extreme damage done to Hamas, Hezbollah, the degradation of Iranian air defense systems, the cratering of the Iranian economy might put pressure on the Houthis. But what we've seen is, I would say, even since 24, 25, a concerted effort to actually upgrade Houthi capabilities and get more stuff into them. Now, that might be a precautionary measure. It may be because the Houthis are now, in some ways, one could argue, at the vanguard of the axis of resistance. They may be sort of in future the most consequential and important player because they're so remote, because they can defend themselves by hiding in mountains, and because they can launch these long range strikes. Forward defense could be moving a little bit further back, if you like. But certainly the level of effort and resource going to supporting the Houthis does appear to have increased over the last couple of years rather than decreased. And the Houthis now do have some, but not all, autonomous capabilities. And I would argue are looking for ways to generate their own revenue and push towards becoming a consequential player in the Horn of Africa, Red Sea, and Middle East in their own right. They're not there yet, but we're at kind of maybe the beginning of a transition phase there.
Military planners have a sort of intuitive understanding of the limitations of materiel or kit, right? That you can send a complex weapon system to a group of fighters, and if they don't know how to use it in the field or integrate it into tactics and strategy, it doesn't make any difference. What we've seen here, or what you've illustrated here with the Houthis, is a real illustration of that maxim, right? It's that it's not that they're figuring out how to get guns or drones or missiles. They're figuring out how to figure out how to get things. And that is, as I understand it from your work, infinitely reproducible once you know how to do it. And in fact, as tactics, maybe today it's drones, Tomorrow it could be something else that we're not thinking of as important. They know how to source things in multiple redundant networks. And that really changes the game. Also, it embeds them in a non-military space, right? These supply chains aren't military supply chains; they are just simply modern logistical supply chains. So this leads me to another pair of questions, one from me, one from the audience. For the first question is, uh, are uh, are there any ways to disrupt these supply chains without shutting down legal, necessary regular commerce? And two, now that they know how to build these types of chains, are they extending them elsewhere? For instance, into the Horn of Africa? And specifically, Yael Warshel asks from the audience whether you've documented any activity, trade, supply chains extending or others extending from the Houthis towards Ethiopia, Somaliland, the Gulf of Aden, or around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Let me know if you need me to repeat any of that.
Could you repeat the first question, and then I'll come to the second one? Sorry.
The first question is there a way of disrupting these types of supply chains without shutting down the life-sustaining, necessary legal trade that brings food, goods, and all the other things that people just need to live?
Yeah, and I think you articulated this point really clearly, and the next phase of this work will dig into this more. Once you kind of systematized the knowledge base and diffuse it across a group like the Houthis, once they've built structures to build and operate these things, they have the knowledge, they can tap into other knowledge, and they've built their own procurement and manufacturing systems. It's much, much harder to disrupt. And then you could try and shut down all legitimate channels of trade. But what we've seen is that the Houthis have become very, very good at getting things into Yemen. So the cost of doing that would potentially actually sort of outweigh its utility. What you want to do is more or less what sort of there's a basic version on for Yemen is find ways of inspecting legitimate commerce at scale, but without completely disrupting flows into the country. But that's a very expensive and hard endeavor and requires kind of long-term commitment from external players financially and potentially militarily as well to do things like deterring people from just sailing cargo ships into Yemen at the right moment. As sort of goes for the Houthis connections in the rest of Africa. I can see this question that you asked in front of me. The particular areas that person names aren't, as far as I know, key to the Houthis. But what we have seen really since sort of 21, 22, and again, another report as part of this project forthcoming later this year, what we have seen is that the Houthis have been building multiple networks of their own in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. So ideological to an extent, strategic with groups like Al-Shabaab, recruiting from marginalized groups, particularly in kind of the north of the Horn up to the top of the Red Sea, working potentially with some groups in Sudan, but also building up their own smuggling networks in the north of Somalia, in Djibouti, probably in Sudan, and potentially in Eritrea. So kind of embedding both as an armed actor and, as you say, as a kind of an illicit and semi-illicit commercial actor across Africa to build out the redundancy of the supply chains, but also building on the reputational gain from being the group that stood up, quote unquote, to Israeli and US aggression and survived, and these potent capabilities that they have. So, as a quick example, our understanding is that there is one armed group in the region that really took an interest in the Houthis because they shot down a lot of US-made Reaper drones using a particular kind of Iranian surface-to-air missile. And this group, Al-Shabaab, thought that was pretty interesting. They were like, we would like in on that action. And once that conversation started, it opened up the door to various other potential strategic initiatives. So, sort of an agglomeration of factors, needs of the Houthis, needs of other groups, are definitely allowing them to expand their reach, their influence, their connectivity into other parts of Africa.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away too much of the work that you're doing now for the next phase of this project, but I've seen some really fascinating data that you've generated about the Houthis moving into Africa and inserting themselves into some existing conflicts and maybe helping groups like Shabab and others start some get ready to start some new ones. So that's an unfortunate but useful next phase of the work. In the final minutes we have, I want to turn to the policy implications. You talked about this a little, but I want to go back to the question of what can be done, both for the United States and also for the other many countries, including Western countries, that depend on free navigation through the Red Sea. You suggested that the Trump administration had been effective at protecting a very narrow set of American shipping interests. And so I wonder, is there a roadmap for some mix of coercive and diplomatic measures that could more broadly protect global shipping for everyone, the global commons through the Red Sea? And are there other mechanisms that you've identified that would be effective at managing or containing or rolling back these supply chains?
Yeah, and I think we can boil that down to two questions. The first is what is on the table? What are policymakers thinking and saying? And then what would be within the realm of the possible if they chose to take more action? And I'd say the reality right now is that where a lot of folks kind of thought that at a certain tipping point, the US would intervene, the broad assumption now seems to be that Israel has its eye on the Houthis. It's building up its intelligence, and that it will attempt to do in Yemen at some point what it's already done, for example, to Hezbollah and Hamas. But that would be a much more challenging proposition than it was to groups that are literally on the Israeli doorstep. Then, from the international perspective, I would say a lot of conversation about the challenge and threat that the Houthis pose, and not a ton of action. And maybe sort of some hope that a political process in Yemen could include provisions where the Houthis provide guarantees on the safety of Red Sea shipping, and perhaps agree to disarm. Extremely difficult for me to see under what circumstances the Houthis would agree to the second point. And of course, with the first point, they can agree to do that and then break that promise if they so choose, and with whatever pretext they choose to throw at it. And then some thinking about sort of this UN verification inspection mechanism that exists in Djibouti, which just seems like a way of shunting the problem onto the United Nations. That mechanism, as we detail in the report, was always there to facilitate the movement of needed humanitarian items into Yemen and provide some reassurances that there was some form of kind of inspection regime for goods entering Houthi ports. It was never designed to be sort of a full-blown inspection and deterrence regime. And that brings us to kind of the final point, what could be done? You could have a multinational, multilateral effort to both heavily inspect goods entering Houthi areas while making sure that goods do continue to move in. And also to provide a policing function, preventing, at a minimum, larger vessels from entering Houthi ports that have not been cleared by that system. But this would be expensive. It would be long term, and it would be high risk. So the Houthis have these weapons. So if you're sending a naval asset, if you're sending a ship to stop someone from smuggling something into Houthi areas, they can ping a missile or a drone at it, and that can cause you some trouble. And frankly, from the conversations that I had recently during a policy trip to the region. I think appetite at the working level for people who think about this on a day-to-day basis, but at the top policy level, I mean, so many international priorities, so many chaotic and challenging issues to deal with, and this new kind of short-term transactionalist approach to deal making that doesn't really lend itself to massive expenditure on surveillance, policing, and political processes. So really tricky to see how you actually get to that place. And my suspicion, frankly, Thanasi, is where we end up is this is allowed to kind of continue for a period. Something blows up, the Houthis demonstrate new capabilities. People talk about that threat, but it'll come kind of slowly and then all at once. It'll become very, very visible, but further down the line, and maybe then people will have a more serious policy conversation.
And I think we're getting close to, or actually we've reached the end of our hour. So I'll say that the implications also of your work, and some of this is contained in this report and will be contained more of it in successor reports, is that this is a multifaceted modern problem that can only be managed rather than conclusively resolved, and it can only be managed through an integrated multilateral approach. Yes, some military force. Yes, lots of policing and interdiction, and yes, lots of need for cooperative work in the illicit trade, because as your work shows, once a container has been sealed with a manifest, a falsified manifest, it's nearly impossible to find the illegal cargo that's in it. So unless you have some kind of cooperative system that includes Chinese suppliers and port officials all over the world, you're not going to make a big dent into this. So I'd like to thank the many people who came and joined us today, and also thank those who come and listen to the recording after the fact. You can read the full report, From Smugglers to Supply Chains: How Yemen's Houthis Became a Global Threat, on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. That's thecenturyfoundation.org. It's a fantastic piece of work that represents several years of labor by a really talented team of researchers in the field and across the world, ably led and coordinated by Peter Salisbury, supported by Accept and the Century Foundation. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Peter. Thanks to our ASL interpreters and to the event staff at Century for putting together this event. Hope to see you at subsequent events around this project, and wishing everyone a nice day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Thanasi.